Could you please identify yourselves? That would be helpful.
I don't know where Julia went to. She's abandoned us. She's supposed to facilitate this portion. But that's fine, I'll do it.
My name is Norman Looker, and I'm with R.J. Burnside International. We're an engineering consulting firm. I have 3 quick questions. One is, why is DFATD sole sourcing foreign entities, NGOs, and organizations as executing agencies when there's perfectly capable NGOs and executing consulting firms here in Canada? So why is that being sole sourced? Why have there been so few calls for proposals in the past 2 years? And why is it taking so long for, once proposals are submitted, for contract negotiations to start? It's sometimes taking 1 to 2 years after proposal submission dates before contract negotiations happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Norman. Well, on question number 1, I think that that's probably a question you should be directing to our CFO, and the CFO colleagues are participating in a number of sessions, so I don't think any one of us is well placed to deal with that. Mark, would you like to answer that question? Take some time to think about it.
Je pense qu'il y a une session en fait sur le processus, là, le processus par lequel le ministère fait affaire.
Cet après-midi, hein?
C'est ça.
Ouais.
Donc, voici une publicité gratuite pour toi, Mark.
Right. So there's a session on that, Norman, this afternoon, and so Mark, put your hand up. Go see Mark, and he'll be happy to have that conversation with you. I mean, as far as calls for proposals go, Lise has certainly been at headquarters a little bit longer than I have. I would say, at least in the time that I've been in partnerships branch, in fact, we've just finished 3. So there's been a lot in close succession, and again, in terms of the negotiations, at least the ones that I've been responsible for, and I've only been around for 12 weeks, but once we had the green light to proceed, once it had gone through the due diligence process, in fact, that moved relatively quickly. So I can't speak to how it was before. I can only say that certainly from our perspective at the officials level and also at the political level, we want to see these processes succeed. So it's incumbent on us to make sure that there's rigor in them, to make sure that we're designing them in a way that allows for opportunities for different kinds of organizations to be able to engage as well. If I take the MNCH call for proposals, which is one of the more recent ones, for instance, we built that one on lessons that we learned from some of the other recent calls for proposals. So we integrated the consortia component, private sector was invited to partner, for instance. So there's new ways that we're coming at calls for proposals. We're trying to rationalize them. We're certainly in active discussions with the Minister's Office to identify where do we want to go, with a number of them going into the future so that we can make sure that they are happening at a more frequent pace. But I would say that there's different kinds of calls for proposals as well. There's the calls that we do in Partnerships for Development Innovation branch, but there's also calls that are done in the geographics. And so, in fact, there's quite a few that we're thinking about, and there's a complementarity that also needs to occur between these things. Je ne sais pas si vous voulez ajouter quelque chose sur ça.
Je pense que c'est assez complet et qu'effectivement on suit les mêmes processus pour faire des appels de proposition, mais ils remplissent différents besoins à différents moments et sont menés par différents contextes. Mais définitivement qu'on regarde également l'ensemble des appels de proposition pour s'assurer qu'il y ait une cohérence et une complémentarité aussi dans les besoins qu'on cherche à remplir pour répondre aux besoins des pays en développement avec lesquels on travaille. Alors, dans mon univers, on regarde vraiment comment on peut utiliser les appels de proposition pour répondre à des besoins spécifiques sur des pays, alors que dans le monde de la direction du secteur du partenariat, c'est davantage thématique et multi-pays, par exemple.
Oui. And just a little advertisement, of course, we've got one closing on Friday on the francophonie skills for development. So that's yet another one that's come forward in the short time that I've been around. Sir.
L'œuvre allégée. Ma question concerne un peu le lien entre l'aide humanitaire et le développement durable. Donc, you mentioned that more and more international humanitarian assistance is going to protracted crises. In fact, I think it's about quintupled the amount that's spent on IHA as a percentage of ODA. So there's been an increase in the amount spent. But there is also a paradox. We had a conference in Montreal at the Lise Foundation on humanitarian assistance. And one of the I guess we call it the failure of humanitarian assistance that we all have to assume, we have to assume our role in that, is that there have been more and more needs and more resources, but more and more people excluded from receiving humanitarian assistance than ever. And I think we've all faced this, and we have bilateral or partnership programs, and we are, because of security reasons, obliged to withdraw our staff, withdraw our programming. At the same time, we're sending more and more people into crises. So the question is, first of all, the first question is, how do we make the link between that? And is there any thinking now on how we might do that? Instead of just pulling out of when there's a crisis and then rushing in after with humanitarian aid in separate areas, is there any way to transition more smoothly in an area, for example, in the north of Mali and north of Cameroon, where we have long-term partners, to be able to transition into a humanitarian assistance program with innovative means, especially for us around the table, a lot of NGOs that have long-term partnerships. So they have unique ways of working in those areas. The second one is whether or not there is room for innovation in IHA. Now, Canada is a small player in humanitarian assistance and must respect international groups that work and that coordinate on aid. So I understand that Canada is quite limited in its ability to play an innovative role. But, pardon?
We're very innovative.
But the question is, in humanitarian assistance, the IHA per se is focused on, and there have been a couple of examples recently of funds being created for that. I'm aware of that. But the IHA is focused very much on delivery, whereas the innovation part, it's a bit harder to put an idea on the table where we might innovate, use Canadian technology, or use the technology and approaches that we have in our long-term sustainable development programs and apply those to IHA. So how would we go about, for example, as an NGO, if we had an idea that we wanted to link that to IHA, how would we do that and make that link? Thank you.
I know you want to say
I want to, but I'll hold back.
I have to defer to her because she's an ADM now, so I'm wondering if she wants to start. Thanks for those great questions. I agree with you. All of the trends that you mentioned are absolutely bang on. The issue of more folks being excluded, it is the part of I think, of being in this position that I find the most challenging, is that when the environment becomes so difficult for our partners to stay and deliver, they must, in fact, get evacuated in many cases. And they have a lot, the security challenges that their staff face must be balanced against wanting to ensure access to beneficiaries. Very strong and clear challenges. We are very strong supporters of the UN's approach to stay and deliver. And that is why, in many cases, we are also very strong supporters financially of the UN, because when the UN structure is in place, it allows then for the plug and play for our NGO partners to be there. I know you know that because you're active in some of these environments. Some of our partners, though, use another mechanism of remote management. Now, that is also has other challenges. It could put your local partners more at risk, but it is also a very important approach that our partners are taking as well. Our partners are also, in many instances, ensuring that they hire people that look more like the beneficiaries now, so that they are trying to be much more, I don't want to say culturally sensitive, but it's also the awareness level is very high there. We as NIHA are very happy to look at all approaches possible that our partners are using. We do try to make the link from the humanitarian to the development side of things, and that is why when there are livelihoods components in humanitarian proposals, we are very open to funding those as part of a larger humanitarian response, because we do see that while we are now talking about resilience and humanitarian action. I'm still less sure what that means. It's something that we're all exploring as a community, but we can really see it in concrete livelihoods activities that our partners are proposing through their proposals they're providing to us. So that is something that we are open to. I don't know if you call that innovation, but certainly we're very open to it. And I will say, we have a very strong track record, actually, of being open to innovation. I just jotted down 3, but I'm sure I have a list behind. So with WFP, the Purchase for Progress, we are one of the strongest supporters of that through IHA. And we are called now MHD under amalgamation, but just for everyone in the room, I'll just say IHA just in responding to you. We also were very supportive with World Vision of the Last Mile project or approach as well. So that was an innovation. And we are one of the strongest supporters of cash and vouchers as a new food assistance tool. In fact, in negotiating the Food Assistance Convention, we, Canada, and I as chair, we did everything we could to make sure that these new innovative tools were part and parcel of the new FAC. Because A, they're the right thing to do. B, we need all of the innovation possible out there to try and access these beneficiaries. And C, we also need to pull on all of these tools to try and ensure that there is some sort of resilience going forward. If not, again, we will be the continuing growing business line, which I think all of us would be very happy to be out of business.
Maybe just to build a little bit on what Leslie said, if I put my previous hat on as our ambassador to the UN in Geneva, I'd say a couple of things that in this area, Canada and Leslie, who's being very modest, has actually been a thought leader insofar as it comes out with new approaches, and again, trying to connect those dots between humanitarian and stabilization and long-term development. If I think of things like the Solutions Alliance, for instance, with UNHCR and a number of non-governmental organizations trying to look at not warehousing people who've been displaced, but actually looking at how do we maximize their skills and make sure that they're ready, whether or not they're going to locally integrate or whether or not they're eventually going to resettle or they're going to be able to be repatriated home. This is an area that's new. It's at the forefront. We're thinking differently about it, and IHA, now MHD, provided the seed money to be able to see some of that work really go forward along with Denmark and Norway. Work that's underway right now on IT and humanitarian action, and thinking about how do we use information technologies differently. We did a lot of this in Afghanistan as a starting point. We're now doing it elsewhere, trying to think creatively about how do we use mobile phone systems, not just to identify people who are in crisis situations, but what does that mean in the weeks after our crisis has occurred? How can we manage and utilize that technology better? If I think about the creation of the crisis pool, for instance, that was an innovation. And we were the only country for a very long time, I think we might still be the only country, that has a pot of money that is set aside within our fiscal framework, which enables Canada to respond quickly when there's a catastrophic event without robbing Peter to pay Paul. So we're not taking money out of our long-term development programs in order to be able to respond. We have funds that are set aside within the fiscal framework to do that. So all this to say that there's a track record of people within the system who want to be innovative. And I think this is where there's really an opportunity for us to have some collaboration. And within the House, I'm certainly keen and interested to see, and this is the part of my title that you're not enthusiastic about, but I am, which is the innovation piece. And so I would like to see, is there a way for my branch, for instance, to help and to play a facilitating role, right? Is that a call for proposals on the horizon where we can think about working as a community to say, should we look at innovative approaches to dealing with some of these questions?
Yeah, she'd mentioned earlier as head of mission, she loved the fact that she could direct assets. So if she becomes the facilitator, she'll be directing assets.
I will never direct your assets. No.
Just to say that, please call us and come in and start with a discussion with us if you have some innovative ideas. That's where we have to begin together.
Could I just very briefly add, because I know there's lots of other questions there, but I wanted to come back to the first part of your question about the continuum between humanitarian assistance going into development, and this is something that is always on our minds. And I just wanted to give the example of South Sudan that I visited recently with actually colleagues from humanitarian assistance. And I wanted to say that this is a country where I think we are very much looking at this. We have development programs there working in maternal, newborn, and child health and food security. And I think that one of the approaches we took there with a number of partners that are probably in the room right now and that work on both fronts, that work on delivering services of humanitarian assistance, but also on developing the capacity, the skills on development. I think that last year we were quite effective, not Canada alone, but Canada certainly, in working in South Sudan in areas where it was possible to work to help people get ready to plant seeds, to keep markets going so that we would prevent food insecurity and more humanitarian assistance being delivered. So both tools were used and we continuously look at doing that and working with partners, and some partners work on both fronts, others only on one or the other. But I think that looking at it together, we can really help to continue to develop, to do the long-term development, even in countries in crisis, of course, when the security situation allows. And I think that we look for working with you to continue to do that.
So why don't we group questions, because we're running out of time. So we'll take, let's say, 3 in quick succession. Ma'am, you were up first on microphone 2, then we'll go to microphone 1. And then microphone 3 in the back, sir.
Merci, bonjour. Fonctionne? Oui. OK. Je n'étais pas assez proche. C'est trop grand, c'est ergonomique. Merci de la présentation. Ça nous permet de se démêler. Je vais enlever ça. Se démêler là, dans les différentes bureaux, structures, etc. Moi, je me présente. D'abord, je suis Lise, je suis du service international de la Fédération des travailleurs et travailleuses du Québec, membre du CTC. On a eu des projets depuis plus de 25 ans là, dans différentes régions du monde. On en a presque plus qui sont financés maintenant par le Canada. Mais nos membres contribuent, par exemple pour Haïti, des centaines de milliers de dollars à la coalition humanitaire et d'autres organisations. Je suis aussi impliquée à Oxfam et d'autres groupes. Nous, la fusion, on avait des inquiétudes, ce que vous appelez les synergies. On se disait, c'est peut-être des contaminations de vision, de valeurs. Ce matin, on a parlé beaucoup de l'importance de lutter contre les causes structurelles de la pauvreté. Et il y a du travail de plaidoyer, de renforcement des capacités qui était fait avec des organisations citoyennes, que ce soit des groupes de femmes, des associations syndicales, etc., pour être capable de faire un contrepoids dans des pays où la gouvernance, parfois, ne permet pas des processus démocratiques. Alors, je ne sais pas qu'est-ce qu'il en est pour l'avenir, mais je me dis, le bon côté de la fusion, c'est cette capacité dont vous avez parlé d'action interministérielle. Il y aura peut-être, que ce soit dans le domaine du travail ou dans d'autres domaines, des discussions qui devront se poursuivre. Je pense à la question de la mobilité des personnes, par exemple. Nous, on continue de faire de la coopération à partir de nos propres fonds. On se fait refuser des visas d'entrée au Canada à des gens qui viennent compléter des formations, participer à des activités de réflexion, des colloques, des congrès. Encore la semaine passée, une consoeur d'Haïti qui est une dirigeante syndicale, qui a un enfant en Haïti à qui on a refusé le visa à un congrès là, national du SFP. Bref, il y a toutes sortes de situations, je pense, qui interpellent d'autres ministères aussi et qu'il faudrait régler si on veut faire du développement à long terme. Et sur la question des innovations, au-delà de l'entreprise privée, bien, il y a aussi des initiatives privées. Je pense toute la question du développement socio-économique, l'économie sociale. Est-ce qu'il y a des ouvertures à ça ou c'est seulement les appels de proposition? Parce qu'au Québec, avec l'Association québécoise de la coopération, on réfléchit à toutes sortes d'idées de mise en œuvre là, pour favoriser le travail décent. Ma question est peut-être un peu longue, je m'en excuse, mais en tout cas, merci de nous avoir présenté les différents services. Sûrement qu'on va aller vous rencontrer. Merci.
Merci. Madame.
Hello, Diana Rivington, and I'm from the University of Ottawa these days.
Be gentle with us.
Forget it. I wasn't gentle when I worked there. Why should I start now?
We know where the bones are now.
I was hoping retirement had made you more gentle.
No. I was very pleased today to get this little note that the DFATD's strategic papers on cross-cutting themes that are now on the web. I haven't looked at them yet. But they're for international assistance. I'd like to know what's happening with gender equality in the political and trade streams at Foreign Affairs, because it is a government-wide policy, and yet our colleagues at DFATD didn't really take it very strongly on board when I was at CETA. As a matter of fact, diminished their commitment to that. And the second question is on innovations. When will we have a proposal call on innovations in making progress on gender equality? Thank you.
Microphone 3.
It's Larry Hendricks. I'm an independent consultant. My question is around the trade. It sounded to me like you're doing it all from the internal, when you have all these people around here who deal with communities who need trade and new equipment. Have you ever considered using them as scouts, essentially, with a if you find a community that wants to buy something, you give them some money for it, either from the company that's going to supply it or from yourselves, and consider whether or not you could use that as a way of doing things instead of trying to, it sounds like what it sounds like, which is doing it inside. Now, I know that for a fact that export in Canada is limited for whatever reason, I don't know. But they only want to do trade with large companies or developed countries instead of doing anything with the countries that are dealt with here. The only ones that you see out there are the mining companies. And that's fine, but they do it by themselves. So I'm just raising this as a question.
Yeah, I'm trying to think how best to respond to your query. I suspect it's one where we'll have to have a longer conversation and hook you up with our colleagues in the Trade Commissioner Service, because in fact that's what the Trade Commissioner Service does every day. Mm-hmm. It's about establishing those relationships, and they're certainly not bound to only their network. In fact, if anything, they try to leverage as much as possible all Canadian information and intelligence that might exist in order to maximize opportunities for Canadian industry abroad. So I would say what you're describing is exactly the mandate of what our Trade Commissioner Service is intended to do, and they very much like to speak to Canadian civil society organizations and individuals. So it's not by any stretch something that we do internally. We're very attuned to the importance of being able to do that with a variety of different stakeholders. Mm-hmm. I don't know, Lise, if you want to build on that.
Well, maybe I can just add that there's a global market action plan that is on the website that was launched several months ago, if not more than that, where we have a number of markets. You were talking also about markets in developed countries versus developing countries. Actually, there are 11 countries, I can speak for my region at least, in that global market action plan that are in Africa. So it is also about supporting efforts of small and medium enterprises in Canada to export in the world in some markets that are more developed. You're right, in markets like the US and Europe, but also in new and emerging markets, including in Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, for example. And also this is where, and just adding about the inside and outside, yes, there is the Trade Commissioner Service that are there to promote that kind of thing. And there's also the Sustainable Economic Growth strategy on the development side, where we can also take advantage of that to develop the capacity in Africa of small and medium enterprises to and link them up with some opportunities with Canada so that you have the kind of win-win situation where you were referring to. So I think that either through the trade commissioners or through development programs targeting small and medium enterprises, there are ways you can engage with our department to discuss that further.
Diana, when it comes to your question about gender equality on the political and the trade streams, I think you're being provocative for fun, but I think you know as well as I do that the commitment to gender equality isn't specific only to the dev stream, and it never has been. And that in fact on the political side, across the board, we've been at the forefront of promoting gender equality in a number of international fora. We've run, for instance, the resolution on combating violence against women in the Human Rights Council for 25 years. I just spent the last 3.5 years managing a number of issues related to promoting and protecting the human rights of women and girls. So, I mean, I think we need probably a longer conversation to be able to highlight all of the things that we're working on, whether or not one sees it as having institutional homes as your indication of whether or not you're committed to something, or whether or not you're addressing it in meaningful ways every day. That's debate that we can certainly have. But at least as far as the political stream is concerned, there's a strong commitment to engaging on women's human rights issues. We continue to do it across the geographic, certainly in the functionals. We do it on the women, peace, and security side. We do it on specific country situations. On the trade side as well, there's been a focus, particularly I would say in the last couple of years, on women's economic empowerment. And that's been a crossover. I would say that's where there's been beneficial influence from the dev team onto the trade team. And what's interesting there is it's also happening domestically within Canada. So our colleagues at Status of Women Canada have been doing a lot of work to try to see how can they enhance, and Minister Leach has been quite strong in trying to say, how can we enhance the number of women CEOs? How do we change the dynamic? How do we support women in small and medium-sized enterprises? And so there's been this really interesting back and forth between what they're trying to do domestically and what we've been looking at doing internationally. And there's been really interesting discussions underway, for instance, with ITC, the International Trade Center, and the work that they've done in this area, discussions that we've been having with the ILO in this area as well, work that had been underway within the WTO as well, in increasing women's access to trade opportunities, and then certainly there's a great deal of work that's been done on the dev side. But again, I see this as where having the amalgamation actually will provide us with some opportunities to poke quite a bit more. If for anything else, than to expand the horizons of some of our colleagues so that they can see linkages that they might not otherwise have seen previously. It's also been a subject that's come up quite a bit in the context of the World Economic Forum, and that's having an influence as well, because we're starting to have this conversation in different and more diverse forums, as opposed to just the usual places. So we're not just having this discussion in the Commission on the Status of Women anymore. It's a conversation that's happening across the board. And I think for us, that's been very helpful, so that we can have this conversation in a variety of different places within the department. But again, je ne sais pas si vous voulez ajouter quelque chose.
Je vais juste ajouter très rapidement pour démontrer un exemple concret de ça. C'était le dernier sommet de la francophonie qui a eu lieu à Dakar, dont le thème était les femmes comme vecteurs de paix. Et moi, ça m'a montré à quel point, évidemment, il y a beaucoup de pays d'Afrique qui sont membres de la francophonie. Et je vois avec la fusion comment on peut vraiment utiliser et faire plus d'effets de levier avec tout le leadership que le Canada a eu sur le côté de la sécurité par rapport au rôle des femmes, et comment on peut vraiment faire des liens avec tout l'agenda de développement, puis avec l'agenda aussi de empowerment économique des femmes. Alors moi, je vois beaucoup d'opportunités en fait maintenant avec la fusion de connecter tous ces agendas-là pour avoir une voix plus forte et faire avancer davantage les enjeux d'égalité entre les hommes et les femmes.
And then in terms of the suggestion to do a call, I think it's really interesting. What I would say is let's talk about it. I'm still new, so now's the time to talk to me about these kinds of opportunities. And then I guess finally the issue about the engagement of the private sector and whether or not we're open to those kinds of conversations. Je dirais que c'est absolument le cas, qu'on aimerait explorer comment est-ce que le secteur privé pourrait être plus engagé dans le développement d'un côté qui est favorable, je dirais. Et ça commence, comme je l'avais mentionné au début, on a un partenariat par exemple avec Desjardins, qui est un début pour nous. Il y a aussi les autres organisations du secteur privé où on commence un dialogue avec mon direction générale. Donc on verra où ça va nous amener, mais je crois qu'il y a un très fort intérêt de s'engager dans ce domaine. Et voilà.